Greetings, everyone. We will be starting our second session of Dr. Fitzgerald's presentation on the Didache, the two ways, ethics of early Christian living. Please.
Give me a moment as I try to hide my wires.
Your green light is on.
Yeah, I see it in the pocket here.
Good.
Feel like, I don't know if any of you ever saw these films like Donnie Brasco, like where, the guy playing Donnie Brasco, or impersonating him, had his recorder and all the wires in the cowboy boots he's wearing, and of course they went to a Japanese restaurant with his mafia associates, and the customary to take the shoes off. And of course that put him in a difficult situation. And so I was just hiding my wires to remind me of that. Except for at least here I don't have to worry about this being my last day among the land of the living as a result. Well, praise God. Going into our next session, I mentioned that I would cover what essentially becomes now the first section. This is chapters 1 through 6 of the Didache. This is the two ways literature that I meant, section dealing with the two ways, the ways of life and the way of death. Actually, way of life and the way of death. There are no multiple ways of life according to this text. Now the key thing to understand about this, the understanding generally amongst scholarship is that this was actually not lifted, that's kind of like a evaluative term, but a Christian adaptation of Jewish literature, which was intended to guide potential converts to Judaism as how to adopt a proper way of life that was pleasing to the Lord. I think it's important for us to understand. See, we understand Christianity as a missionary religion. We understand that, for example, Islam is a missionary religion as well, for example. I don't think we understand that Judaism, I think in theory at least it's today, I don't think it is in practice today particularly. But certainly in Roman times it was a missionary religion. They did accept converts. Well, they do accept converts today too. It's not like Zoroastrianism, which at least the Parsis, the groups in India, do not accept converts typically. But that's beside the point. In any case, Judaism at that time was a missionary religion. So there would have been a need for, people, let's think like the centurion, like Cornelius and some of these other folks, some of the people like we're reading from the Gospels who, like some of the Roman centurions and soldiers and stuff who had a good reputation with the Jews of being righteous people, who had the Jewish, cared for Jewish interests. So we read in the New Testament. There was a community of people who appreciated Jewish ethics, and many may not have gone full hog and become Jews, but they adopted many of the ethics and appreciated it. But if somebody did choose to convert to Judaism, they needed instruction on how to live, before they would go the full way and become circumcised and become fully adopted into the Jewish community. And so this two ways literature originally would have been adopted to help, basically somebody who is not a Jew, who is in the process of studying to become a Jew, to become Jewish, and how they should conduct their lives. Now, when the early Christian church, which arose out of these same circles, is going to try to do the same thing, it would tend to make sense that they might adapt this literature for their own ends. And let's think, how different could it possibly be, really? And see, I think that's also something for us to understand. The scriptures at this time in the Christian church would have been the same scriptures that the synagogue Jews were following as well, what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Of course, the Christians would have been following the Greek translation, but so also would many of the Jewish people have been following. That might have been what the language they understood. Certainly, the Pharisees would have understood Hebrew, and they were the ancestors of what has become rabbinical Judaism. But the scriptures would have been the same. The lifestyle, outside of maybe diet, and some things, would essentially have been the same. So it's a perfectly sensible thing to do. I think this is understood that at this time, Christianity and Judaism, well, would have been various Jewish religious groups. Both were missionary religions, both in competition with each other, and both in many ways sharing many similar ethics and ways of living one's life. And as a result, actually, when we look at our two-way chapters 1 through 6, and you look through Jewish literature at the time, one does see some very similar content in different places. And if, for example, like one has, like, for example, ways of light and way of darkness, you have, like, in the community rule, the Qumran text, which I'll be going to in more detail a little bit. We'll talk about, like, the two spirits rather than two ways. There's also the Testament of Asher, which is, I don't know how genuine that is. It survives only in Slavonic translations from medieval times. Presumably there's a Jewish text, maybe Aramaic or something behind that. I don't know. Nobody's discovered that yet, so I haven't gone to that yet. But the content is similar to that. Also, the Epistle of Barnabas, which I had mentioned earlier, has its own two-way section, chapters 18 through 20. And it's using it in a rather similar way. The difference being mainly, two. First of all, in the Didache, it's the first 6 chapters 1 through 6, a total of 6 out of 16 chapters. Barnabas, it's toward the end. It's basically 3 chapters out of a total of 21 chapters. The content is very similar between the two. And so the assumption is, at first people thought that, well, it looks like the Didache may have taken this from the Epistle of Barnabas. The assumption these days is that they both got them from Jewish predecessors, from this, Jewish tradition lies underneath both of them, which seems to be more logical. I would say the biggest differences that I noticed in reading the two, not so much in moral content, that's pretty much the same. I would say that the Didache is a bit more expanded, being about twice as long. The other thing is that it does have certain comments in it, like, that make it very clear that this is a Christian text and not a Jewish one. For example, saying that Christians should confess their sins to one another, confess their sins in church, and is specifically saying in church. That was something like a good Jew would read, and they would say, well, all right, that's who this is. But my suspicion, and when I was reading through the 3 chapters of the 2 ways of the Epistle of Barnabas, that it doesn't seem to be quite so worked over. Or that it is, I could think a good Jew at the time could have read that section and feel very comfortable with it. So it seems like, in a way, maybe the Didache is a little more adapted, that section, a little bit more Christianized. In any case, that would be interesting, I think, to do a detailed study of what, somebody actually did a scholarly article comparing that and its usage. Actually, it's probably been done. But in any case, I think what's important to understand is, okay, we understand that there's a Jewish predecessor behind it, but more importantly, that Jewish predecessor is actually the Hebrew Scriptures. I mean, for example, the biblical roots of this tradition are found in Deuteronomy Chapter 30, particularly verses 15 through 19. We see it Jeremiah 21, the Wisdom of Sirach 33. And I might as well just read, first of all, just read these things to you. For example, to give you an idea. Let's just go to the introduction. Very first sentence in the Didache, very first page. There are 2 ways, a way of life and a way of death. And the difference between these 2 ways is great. I'll just stop there. That's really the main point there. Let's look at, Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 15. See, I have set before thee this day life and good, and death and evil. And that I command thee this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, and his statutes, and his judgments, that thou mayest live and multiply. And the Lord thy God shall bless thee in the land whither thou goest to possess it. But if thine heart turn away, so thou wilt not hear, but shalt be drawn away, and worship other gods, and serve them, I denounce unto you this day that ye shall surely perish, and that ye shall not prolong your days upon the land, whither thou passest over Jordan to go to possess it. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. I think we can see the roots there. But let's look at the Yerushalmi Targum on these same verses. This is an English translation of, the Targums are Aramaic translations of the Hebrew text. And so we'll go with the translation of that, an English translation of those very same verses from the Yerushalmi Targum, from the Jerusalem Targum. For the word uses Fithgama, is nigh you, in your schools. Open your mouth, that you may meditate on it. Purify your hearts, that you may perform it. Behold, I have set before you this day the way of life. Notice that term. Wherein is the recompense of the reward of good, and unto the righteous. And the way of death. Well, it's right there. Wherein is the retribution of the wages of evil unto the wicked. For I teach you today to love the Lord your God, and to walk in the ways that are right before him, and to keep his commandments, statutes, and judgments, and live and multiply, that the Lord your God may bless you in the land in which you are entering to possess it. But if you think in your heart that you will not obey, but will go astray to worship the idols of the nations and serve them, I proclaim to you this day that you will perish, and will not prolong your days on the land to which you are to pass over the Jordan to possess it. I attest this day, not only you who are to pass away from this world, but the heavens and earth, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and its reverse. Choose therefore the way of life, even the law, that you and your children may live the life of the world to come. As you notice here, already specific, the way of life, the way of death. I mean, talking about dead on what the Dila is talking about. Jeremiah 21:8. Unto this people thou shalt say, Behold, saith the Lord, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. And let's look at Sirach. This would be what we consider one of the apocryphal texts. Why doth the sun one day excel another, when as all the light of every day in the year is of the sun? By the knowledge of the Lord they were distinguished, and he altered seasons and feasts. Some of them he hath made high days and hallowed them. Some of them he hath made ordinary days. And all men are from the ground, and Adam was created of earth. In much knowledge the Lord hath divided them, and made their ways diverse. Some of them hath he blessed and exalted, and some of them he sanctified, and set near himself. But some of them he cursed and brought low, and turned out of their places. As the clay is in the potter's hand to fashion it at his pleasure, so man is in the hand of him who made him, to render to them as liketh him best. Good is set against evil, life against death. So is the godly against the sinner, and the sinner against the godly. To look upon all the works of the Most High, and there are two and two, one against the other. It's pretty unambiguous. So we see that this two ways literature, yes, it has a Jewish background, immediate one, but all of them are clearly rooted in the Old Testament scriptures. And again, this is also testimony, again, to the very Jewish community of how Jewish the early church was. For the first several decades, this is something Jean Daniel, who was a major Jesuit scholar of this period and early Christian history, has commented that it tends to be overlooked by later historians that the first decades of the church, Jewish Christianity was predominant. It's easy to forget now since, it's like, should somebody come from a Jewish background become a Christian? That's seen as like almost somebody to be a celebrity, something to be celebrated as a little unusual. That would not have been the case in the early church. And it's, I think, very important to correct many of our attitudes and to beware about fallacies of anti-Semitism and other kinds of bigotries, to avoid these things. Because if we were to adopt these kind of hatreds, not only is hatred a sin, and we know that, it doesn't matter who you hate, it's evil, but we'd be showing a lot of ingratitude to the early church, to the founding periods of the church, but also Christ himself, who was Jewish, and the Mother of God, who was Jewish, and all the apostles, the writers of the Didache and these early writers, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch. These were people who, came from Jewish backgrounds at this time. And we need to remember this early flavor of the Christian community. And so this is just an important aspect of it. As I had mentioned, some various different ways of similarities between some of these texts. But it's interesting. We have specifically, like I mentioned, in the Didache, the way of life versus the way of death. Now it's interesting, I had mentioned on and off the community rule from the Qumran scrolls. That's actually rather long, it may be about 20, 30 pages in translation. But it's interesting, it doesn't talk about a way of life and way of death so much, but you see this kind of duality there. You have way of life, way of death, that's a duality. The community rules have sons of light versus sons of darkness, or the angel of truth versus the spirit of falsehood, or the prince of light and the angel of darkness. Now, interesting, these angels are actually both created by God, which is interesting. This is kind of indicative, this is from the Qumran community, which makes one think that there's some influence perhaps from Zoroastrian or Iranian dualism. The Ahura Mazda versus the Anga Mainyu, the good God, Ahura Mazda, creator of the good, the Anga Mainyu, who would be the creator of all evil things, and the struggle between the two, which are ultimately won by the good God, Ahura Mazda. In this case, this dualism, both angels are actually created by God. And in fact, what I'll do is just to give you a little flavor of that text, since I do have it here, at least in translation. Let me just read a little bit of it to give you the flavor. Let's see. This is God. He hath created man to govern the world, and he appointed for him two spirits in which to walk until the time of his visitation, the spirit of truth and the spirit of injustice. Those born of truth spring from a fountain of light, but those born of injustice spring from a source of darkness. All the children of righteousness are ruled by the Prince of Light and walk in the ways of light. But all the children of injustice are ruled by the angel of darkness and walk in the ways of darkness. The angel of darkness leads all the children of righteousness astray until his end. All their sin, wickedness, and all their lawful deeds are caused by his dominion in accordance with the mysteries of God. So you get an idea here. This is perhaps maybe one of the more eccentric sectarian groups of the time, but you have this rather strong dualism between the angels of light, angels of darkness, those who are following the various communities, those following like the angel of truth versus the spirit of falsehood. You see that the terminology is not exactly the same, but that dualistic mindset of two different distinct paths are very real here. It is interesting in this case, by making the angel of darkness actually a creation of God, which has happened in the mysteries of God, which is what they're teaching. It's certainly not something any Christian would say. That's also not something that Pharisaical Judaism, Rabbinical Judaism would say either. But it does show you just the varieties of the kinds of thought and religious experience that was floating around in the Jewish religious circles of this time. And this certainly seems to betray definitely influence of Iranian religion here. So that's something I think is interesting. Now, I do need to just do a quick aside also about the other text, which is going, it will, when talking about the Didache, gets brought up a lot. That's the Epistle of Barnabas. Now, if you have this publication, which I have, you have the Xerox version, it's actually just before the Didache in this text. In the original codex, it apparently just followed the Didache. But since they both share, this two-way section, and I guess it's good to talk about it a little bit. We had mentioned that our text, the Didache, seems to be an instructional text as best we can gather for people who are becoming Christians. The particular section, chapters 1 through 6, dealing with the two ways, the ways of life and death, is giving moral instruction of what it means to live as a Christian. The next section, 7 through 15, will be dealing with various regulations dealing with worship, baptism, the Eucharist, life in the church. And then chapter 16, the final section, will be expectations, since the end, basically a call to earnestness and being watchfulness, because the coming of the Lord is soon. Now that's what the emphasis of that final section is. The Epistle of Barnabas is something very different. We say epistle, that means it's a letter. Well, unlike the letter to the Hebrews, which is called that, the letter to Hebrews is not a letter. But this Epistle of Barnabas is indeed an epistle. It is written by Barnabas to a particular community. Where was this community? Well, truth be told, we don't really know. The general assumption is that it's probably Alexandria is the most likely. And the evidence for it is probably maybe even weaker than the evidence we have from the Didache about the Syrian origins of the Didache. Because chapter 9 refers to Syrians, and it's talking about should one be circumcised? Here's the struggle in that chapter. Should one be circumcised? Against those who say that one must be, Barnabas is arguing to the community, well, certainly Syrians, Arabs, and certain Arab priests, Egyptian priests, are circumcised. And so what good does the physical circumscription do then? Now, what kind of evidence is that? Well, the assumption being is that, after all, they did mention Egyptian priests. Certain Egyptian priests are being circumcised, so therefore, the Christian community this time would have been circled probably around Alexandria. And so most likely there. Well, the problem with that is it does mention also Syrians and Arabs following similar practices. And also I'm not that certain that, given the Serapis cult and the Isis cult, particularly the Isis cult, had gotten quite popular. The Serapis cult is kind of a Roman Hellenistic cult, loosely based on Egyptian religion, but I'm not so certain that people in the Roman Empire would have been ignorant about whether certain Egyptian priests were circumcised or not. They might have known that, so that might not be as compelling as we think. It was first, this text outside of itself was first attested to by Clement of Rome. Not Clement of Rome, forgive me, I keep saying that, Clement of Alexandria. But Clement of Alexandria was not from Alexandria. He, basically was also widely traveled, especially in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. So all this really does is limit its origin to someplace very strictly in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. That means not very much. But the reference to the Egyptian priests and so forth, okay, so it's a bit suggestive that yes, this might be Alexandrian origin. It's certainly possible. There's nothing here that would contradict that. It's probably even a notch weaker than the evidence we have for Syria about the Didache. But this is, like I said earlier, these texts are snapshots, but they're not digital SLR or SLR snapshots, single lens reference of wonderful sharp photos of nice wide-angle lenses or telephoto lenses to zoom in on what we want. These are the Kodachrome snaps. Snap, and here's the old black and white. I had some color ones. My colors always are fuzzy too. And we look at it and you can only get so much from them. Sadly, we'd like to get just a little more definition on these points, but we're not going to get them from these texts. Now, the interesting thing about Barnabas is, what was he doing? He was writing a letter to some community. Let's assume, since it's slightly more likely than not, there was a Christian community in Alexandria. But he was actually, the main focus of the Epistle of Barnabas was to, in effect, what is the proper means of interpreting the text, the scriptural text, and what is proper biblical hermeneutics, or the interpretation of the Bible? What will be the Bible? The Hebrew Scriptures at this point. His point being, and he took a pretty radical viewpoint, was that there's only one proper hermeneutic to interpret the Old Testament. That is the spiritual interpretation of seeing Christ in the Old Testament. Anything else, everything else is wrong. The literal interpretation of it, is just a surface one, and therefore is wrong. So therefore, he's pretty much arguing that it's not like the Jews had it somewhat right, the Jewish community had it somewhat right. He said they always got it wrong, because they were always interpreting after the flesh, and they never understood the spiritual meaning of the text, which is in Christ only. That is a pretty radical statement. I mean, because I remember I was reading that, and I was thinking, wow, how do you kind of make out David and Moses and Joshua? Well, obviously, he wasn't thinking absolutely every leader. But any given time he says, well, what did the Jews do when Moses got the 10 Commandments? They made the golden calf. And he ended up smashing the tablets, which indicated then the covenant was already broken. I mean, it's pretty radical interpretations of this, which you could see why, like reading this, why that text may not have been adapted into the canon. Because as much as it certainly reads like certain Christian anti-Jewish polemics at the time, that's a pretty radical take of it. But which is interesting, though, is that the question, arises to me is, when you read the text, it's obvious that this Barnabas is writing to this community, presumably in Alexandria, because there's some crisis going on. But we don't know what the crisis is. He does refer to the destruction of the Jewish temple, so it's 7 years later, and it seems not much later. So what is this crisis? Well, we don't know. I suspect that we might know, really. We know from the book of Galatians and elsewhere the problem of people called Judaizers. The groups of Jewish Christians who insisted that all Christians essentially should become circumcised and follow the Mosaic laws for their daily lives, in contradiction to the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. My suspicion is that the only reason you would write a letter like this, talking about interpreting the Old Testament this way and in such forthright terms, is if he's dealing with a community that is dealing has a lot of Judaizers in it, or is actually Judaizers are very influential there, or maybe converting them. I don't know. That's my surmise, is that there must be a community that's very heavily affected by this, because I cannot think of another reason why anybody would write a letter like that. And one could imagine that this would be a very powerful polemic if you're saying, hey, if you're not a Jewish person of Jewish background becoming a Christian, you don't have to follow the full Mosaic laws. You don't have to follow the Jewish, code of, diet. Just avoid foods that are strangled and offered to idols. That's what I think it is. I think that that's a specific, it's definitely a specific letter written by Barnabas to these people. I think, in my opinion, and I'll say that because I think it was written because they may have been heavily influenced by Judaizers or under attack by them, in the sense of maybe they're people trying to convert them to that way of thinking. That at least makes sense to me. That, however, I doubt we'll ever know as a fact. However, I guess there's one thing. Who is this Barnabas? Well, the ancient church used to think it was the Apostle Barnabas. But that would have been a little difficult. We know this was written after the fall, the destruction of the temple. And nothing, he prohibits it being the apostle, but he might have gotten pretty old by that time. And it doesn't mean it was written in 71. It may have been 80. It may have been a little later. It's often pushed up to 140. But there's nothing in it says that it's the apostle who's referred to in the book of Acts. So, but it was written by somebody called Barnabas. We don't know who this person was, other than that's his name. But generally, scholarship does not accept that this is written by the Epistle of Barnabas. But it was a letter from a certain Barnabas to this community, presumably based in Alexandria, although evidence for that's a little weak, in response to a certain crisis, which is referred to in the text, but not explicitly described. But I think that maybe he has, and we just didn't pick up on it, because why would you talk this way and worry so much about the proper interpretation of Scripture unless you're dealing with somebody who feels there's the need to take it, very literally, in the sense, a way that perhaps the synagogue Jews might interpret it, or certain groups, like the Judaizing sects, might do that. Yeah, that's what makes sense to me. The reason I'm mentioning this is because these are written around the same time. They're both very different texts. One an epistle, and ours is an instructional text, a kind of a catechetical text, let's say. That's reading things backward a little bit, but let's think of it that way. One arises apparently out of Antioch, ours, which is most likely. The other arising, at least addressed to a community in and around Alexandria, which certainly quite possible. So in any case, it's just important. These are two texts. We're going to run into them. They both use this two ways documentation. The interesting thing about the two ways documentation in Barnabas is it seems to be less worked over than the Didache. So with all this seemingly diatribe against certain methods of interpreting the Old Testament, I think any Jewish believer from that time might have been able to pick up that two ways text out of the Epistle of Barnabas and read it and had no problem with it. Because it looks like most of it was lightly touched over. In any case, it's good to just, whenever we read the Bible text, we're going to hear about Barnabas. I felt it was good to just talk about a little aside about Barnabas. And maybe sometime, we should do a study on Barnabas, because that's an interesting text, and it deals with how should we interpret Scripture. And that certainly has been an argument from literally the days of Jesus Christ until now. And this is a very early example of somebody who certainly stuck his flag on a hill and was willing to die for it. And definitely made his point very clear. Whether we agree with it entirely or not, it's another matter, but at least we know where that Barnabas stood. He made that very clear. But getting on, let's go back to our old document and start reviewing it a bit. Chapter 1 of this two-way section begins essentially with a statement based on Matthew 22, verses 35 through 40, and which then reflects back on Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. Now, what do I mean? I'm citing all these verses. Essentially, the golden rule. So let me just read it. Let's go with Didache 1. It's essentially sentence 2. And I'll just read it. It's if you look at it, you'll see after the first thing, way of life and death, and the difference between them, the very next sentence should be this. The way of life is this. Notice he's now talking about the way of life. Thou shalt love first the Lord thy Creator, and secondly thy neighbor as thyself. And thou shalt do nothing to any man that thou wouldst not wish to be done to thyself. If you really want to understand the whole content of this section of the Didache, you don't really need to go further than this. It's stating right away what it's all about, and the rest becomes an explication of it. Let's read what Matthew says, Matthew 22. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him, that's Christ, a question, tempting him, saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Okay, well, let's go back. Where is Matthew getting his information from? Let's read Deuteronomy, chapter 6:5. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Bit 1. Now let's go to Leviticus 19:18. Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. Bit 2. So we see clearly the scriptural import of this. And let's see what the community rule has to say. It actually has a text somewhat like this, somewhat different scope, and I'll talk about that. But let's read that.
The community rule plan?
Of the community rule from the Qumran community. I keep saying community rule, that's a subsection from it. And essentially it's giving a series of rules of how to live in this community, and actually has subsections dealing with those who are leaders, those are members, followers, etc. Everybody's got their own sets of rules. But this is what it has to say. But the God of Israel and his angel of truth will succor all the sons of light. For it is he who created the spirits of light and darkness, and founded every action upon them, and established every deed upon their ways. And he loves the one everlastingly, and delights in its work forever. But the counsel of the other he loathes, and forever hates its ways. These are their ways in the world, for the enlightenment of the heart of man, that all the paths of true righteousness may be made straight before him, and that the fear of the laws of God may be instilled in his heart. And get this, a spirit of humility, patience, abundant charity, unending goodness, understanding and intelligence. A spirit of mighty wisdom which trusts in all the deeds of God, and leans on his great loving kindness. A spirit of discernment of every purpose, a zeal for just laws, of holy intent, a steadfast of heart, and of great charity towards all the sons of truth, of admirable purity which detests all unclean idols, of humble conduct sprung from understanding of all things, and a faithful concealment of the mysteries of truth. These are the counsels of the Spirit of the sons of truth in this world. As for the visitation of all who walk in the Spirit, it shall be healing, great peace, and a long life and fruitfulness, together with every everlasting blessing and eternal joy in life without end, a crown of glory and a garment of majesty in unending light. Now what's interesting is it's talking about, the emphasis on humility, love, patience, forbearance. And so it's very much, you can see how much this is reflecting the golden rule somewhat. That's the point I wanted to get. And there's a similar content here. However, one thing that's very interesting in the community rule here, the Qumran community, versus the Didachi, what Christ is saying, and then Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Deuteronomy and Leviticus is basically, there's no limit to the scope of humanities who is encompassed in this behavior. We are all to love God before all, so that's something, nobody in Qumran would dispute that. But who are to be the recipients of this beneficence which we are to show to other people? Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Matthew, and the Didachi agree is all humanity is the scope. We are to treat all people this way. The Qumran community, fellow members of the community. It's a definite distinction. These are the ones. And even then, when they're talking sons of darkness, they're not thinking of some lowly Roman or Greek or some Arab or, God forbid, who these other off the side of the world kind of people that they must have thought, it seems. It's basically Jews who follow temple laws. And apparently the Qumran sect, there was some, goes back apparently to the times of the Hasmonean period. I don't know the history real well. And apparently there was there's endless complaints about a particular high priest in Jerusalem who seems very, 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 very wicked. And they rebelled against him. And so standard issue Jews, which might have been, Pharisaic Jews or perhaps following the Sadducees, among others, would all have been evil, and we're the true community. So their world really was the evil people, all these regular Jews. We're the righteous folks are, well, that's us, our group, and the beneficence is only to this group. And so that seems to be the whole scope of the thing is, and then the Lord knows what the rest of the world. I think they just fall off the edge someplace. But I think what's interesting is, although certainly the morality being inculcated is essentially, the rules are very similar, but the extreme sectarianism of this Qumran community, which is very clear, I think it's indicative is that they're only concerned about that, and that shows kind of the sectarian nature of this group. And I think this is one of the things that we need to be mindful of, just generally as Christians, as Orthodox Christians certainly, but everybody is. We need to be careful not to become like utterly fanatical in our attitudes about things. And it's interesting that Didache will warn against fanaticism, specifically points it out. And I'll come to that in a little bit. Because if we kind of get into that mentality, what happens is all of a sudden the parameter, the borders of our love start contracting very much to only encompass the people whom we love, which can be basically a small set of people like us. And the Didache, the teachings of Christ, what we see in Matthew, and certainly in the Old Testament, are not that constricted. So we need to beware of the sectarian mentality. But it's interesting. That's why I brought that in, because it's obvious in context that you do see this sort of sectarian kind of mentality being brought into it. In any case, okay, point is now made. We go on from there. Now the rest of chapter 1 consists mainly as elaborating, like this text that I just did, and it's based mainly on the Sermon on the Mount. And especially, well, it's going to be Matthew chapter, it's like 5 chapter, verses 26, 33 through 26, 38 through 42, etc., and the beginning of chapter 6. The things that really particularly receive the focus here is the forbearance of abuse from others, and the importance of giving versus receiving. These are, a lot of other things will be coming into it. But when it talks about that, so somebody, you receive a blow, you don't give a blow back. But then it starts talking about the importance of giving. And one should not take. And it's actually interesting, it's very critical of takers. As if one's in need, that's one matter, according to the Didache. But if you took, presumably from the tills of the church, is what they're talking about, from the communal roles and the support, and you didn't need it, he said there will be a reckoning for that. And and it warns, the warning about that Christ gives as regard, like, to make right with your neighbor and be reconciled and pay your debt, or lest you be cast into prison, etc., and you're forced that you're in there until you pay back your very last farthing. It's interesting, that is taken in this context of, one should be a giver and not be a taker. One should be generous. And also forbearance is what's it. So it's interesting that that's a particular take that they're really putting on that, which I gotta admit, it's pretty interesting. Now chapter 2 starts going on. Now chapter 2, we did chapter 1 is essentially, especially talking about the golden rule. Chapter 2 is reads more, and I believe it's essentially a Christian exposition of the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments. And so what it boils down to, if you go through that section, you'll find that it goes through the various sorts of things. Like, for example, it prohibits naturally murder, but it also mentions sorcery, abortion, infanticide, etc. It sort of terms all the possible things that could possibly be murder, which people are actually doing, presumably. So you see that. Murder, sorcery, abortion, infanticide. Then you see adultery, sodomy, fornication brought in, essentially dealing with the commandment against adultery in the Decalogue. Then you have theft, false witness, covetousness, also as being forbidden as well, basically under not coveting thy neighbor's goods. And we see the specific examples from Exodus, like sort of chapter 20 of Exodus, particularly verses 13, 14, basically 13 through 17. or the content I'm talking about. And in Matthew chapter 5, and essentially verses, 21 through 22, 27 through 32, etc. And also interesting, it forbids magic and sorcery. Now, where are the commandments against that in the Decalogue? Well, those would tend to fall under the category of worshiping other gods, basically idolatry. Thou shalt have no other God before me. That's where that would be violated. And indirectly, it's talking about Matthew reflecting on, especially the first 7 verses of Exodus 20, but also Matthew 5:24. Now then it ends with talking about the expectations that Christians are to be humble. And as which is also another thing that you'll hear about from the community rule as well, as it commends humility towards one another. So it's interesting. So you have first chapter 1 talks about the golden rule, and it's interesting. The content is dead on with what we're seeing with what Christ is saying, but it's not word for word, which certainly indicates a couple things. Similar community as Matthew, which Matthew is assumed to come out of the Christian community of Antioch. But it's not an exact quote either, which makes it sound again that we're dealing with these early oral sources, and this might be considered an example of that. So chapter 1 is dealing with the golden rule and how to live it and explication of it. Chapter 2 now broadens its focus to dealing with the 10 Commandments and an elaboration of that. Chapter 3 does the same thing as chapter 2, but it takes a different angle. It tends to stress the avoidance of smaller sins to avoid greater ones, and which happen to be very sound rabbinical ethics as well. In fact, when we think about the Pharisees and people accuse them of legalism, and all these seemingly nitpicky rules, I think it's important to understand why did they create these rules. And the concept was that certainly we must keep the commandments of the Lord, which the Lord has revealed in Scripture. But how many times in life is it so easy to transgress accidentally? Through acts of thoughtless, whatever. So the thought was, we should build a fence or a wall around these things, so that if you don't violate that wall, you're certainly not going to violate, the main commandments. So that's for example, when you have the kosher restrictions, not having dairy foods and meats on the same plate. It really goes back to a restriction. It may sound a little abstruse to us, but thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk, which is don't be cruel to animals. That's just a cruel thing to do. Of course, the kid's not going to know it at that point, but the thought just is cruel, and it is advising against the cruelty to animals. But so the mentality, why separate plates as it's practiced now? But the separation of dairy products from milk is meant to be a wall. If you're not going to violate this, then you certainly aren't going to do this other one as well. That's the mentality. And truth be told, it's easy. One can go too far with that. But then again, one can go too far with any sort of moral teaching and become legalistic. Anybody can find a way to be legalistic. But let's admit that there is some wisdom to that approach. If you know that certain small sins tend to lead to greater sins, and you stay away from those smaller sins, it makes it a lot easier to avoid the big sins that way. And so, what the Christians are teaching here is essentially the same thing. A Jewish community would not necessarily disagree with that. And so let's take a little look at how they're looking at this. And essentially, if we want to look at Scripture, I guess there's one verse, it's 1 Thessalonians 5:22, it says it best. King James will say, the Authorized Version will say, abstain from all appearance of evil. Or if we read the World English Bible, abstain from every form of evil. Don't even look like you're doing something evil, essentially. Keep that distance. And these are some examples. It'll start out first avoid bad company, which is interesting. I guess the mentality is, well, if you avoid bad company, that's step number 1 in the right direction. But then it's interesting. Avoid anger, fanaticism, and quarreling. Notice it's what I warned about, fanaticism. It specifically mentions that. Why? Because these sins lead to murder, the violation of one of the 10 Commandments. It also says, avoid lust, unclean talk, the roving eye. These protect against other offenses to protect against adultery, that lead to that. Also, avoid omens, witchcraft, astrology, and magic, and don't even be witnesses to these ceremonies. Why? Because that implies idolatry, having other gods before God. Avoid lying. Avoid grumbling, extreme opinionation, having super strong opinions about things. Why? Because that could lead to blasphemy. And then it changes tones and starts talking about humility, mutual love, and forbearance being of utmost importance. Also advises, it's interesting in talking about avoiding bad company, now it talks about the kind of company you should keep, and it says seek honest and humble folk rather than persons of eminence. Now I found it actually rather interesting. It's not saying that you can have no rich relatives or no rich friends, but I think it's talking about the easy temptation to play favoritism and to want to seek it. It means don't try to be exalting yourself, having a good reputation and set yourself up for a reputation before people. Don't be a snob. And it's putting it in this context. But I also think that it reveals something else about this community. If we're dealing with the period of 70 to 90 AD, which I think this is coming from, this early, this is a community that would not have had very high and mighty converts yet. There may have been a few, but not many. And so the community, it might have had more people from a business background, maybe laboring background. You will talk about like how to treat slaves. Then again, we see that in the book of Philemon as well. So these might be people who have enough money to have a slave or so. But not necessarily, we're not dealing like with the Julio-Claudian dynasty here. That would be likely converts. So the sort of thing we could say, well, there might be, the high and mighty of this world, they're the ones who are the pagans and are persecuting us. I think there's a reflection of this kind of community. So I think that's also interesting. But it's interesting, then it goes back and talking about humility and forbearance, again, as something very essential. And it is interesting, I guess I'll read it, is that again we see that same talk, in the community rule, from the Qumran community. And let me just put it like this. Let's see what they say here. They're talking about people, how they should live in this community. And they shall separate from the congregation of men of injustice and shall unite with respect to the law and possessions under the authority of the sons of Zadok, the priests who keep the covenant, and of the multitude of men of the community who hold fast to the covenant. Every decision concerning doctrine, property, and justice shall be determined by them. You see the communal living there. There's also, we mentioned earlier, but also they shall practice truth and humility in common, and justice and uprightness and charity and modesty in all their ways. What this tells us about this early Christianity and the moral code which is being taught here, it's essentially the same moral code. It's the same moral code that the Pharisees were teaching, that rabbinical Judaism teaches. Christ was not, trying to abolish the law in the sense we think, rather to fulfill it. And of course, he fulfilled it in his own, incarnation, death, burial, and resurrection. But he was also commending not just the outward appearances, but keeping it in one's heart as well, in the fullness of what the intentions are. And any good Jew of that time would have agreed with him on that. What Matthew was saying, what the Didache is saying, is love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and your neighbor as yourself. There's nothing un-Jewish about that. That's actually extremely Jewish, and that's, I think, something very important. And that is why this community could have this Jewish document, adopted for their own needs, granted, used because it was essentially saying things they found very helpful. If they weren't doing it because they found it unhelpful or unusable, they wouldn't have used it then. They found it very helpful, and lots who commend it. And so they adapted it a bit to their own needs. So that's something I think is very important for us to understand. Christians were not teaching some radical new ethic that Jews had already not heard. Jews had already been teaching that, and good Jews were trying to follow this. This is, the distinguished Christians of who is Christ. We understand him as the Messiah, and his specific role for our salvation is what's going to distinguish Christians from the others, but not necessarily the moral code. So I think that's very important to understand. Now going on further, and especially it's interesting, this specific avoid the little sins to avoid the greater one. That is a particularly rabbinical approach. It's not something that somebody coming outside would necessarily have thought of. Now chapter 4 goes on. It's interesting. It talks about honor those who proclaim the word of God, basically, whether they be bishops or deacons, apostles, prophets, or whatever. And we think of 1 Timothy 5:17, Hebrews 13:17, giving them honor or double honor, for the seeking an honorable office. It recommends gathering together often. Hebrews 10 recommends that we gather together even as we see the times of the coming God is coming close. We're to practice mutual generosity. I read for the Qumran rule just there about how they're to practice generosity amongst each other. We even see that there. But we saw that from the text in Acts, mutual generosity in the sharing of profits. And then approach prayer with a clean conscience and confess one's faults in church, which reminds one of James 5:16, and I'll go to this later, which is talking about confess your sins one to another. So we're seeing the very close relation of, you see in chapter 4, here we're seeing a lot of text which are clearly being reflected in Hebrews, the pastoral epistles, but also the Qumran community. It's very Jewish, but also we're seeing how closely related it is to the ethics that what we're seeing in some of the later portions of the New Testament, later time-wise, that is. And also chapter 4 will talk about master-slave relations. In short terms, mutuality in love and respect, and there should be no partiality, but one should deal gently with one's slaves. And it reminds one of the book of Philemon, where Onesimus was a runaway slave, is being returned to his master Philemon. And Paul is recommending forbearance. He said, for now you have a brother in Christ, and he should be a better slave as a result. But he said, now you're brothers in Christ, so it's don't focus on the outward appearances. They're not abolishing slavery here, but is recognized that God does not look at outward appearances. That's something that's being very much inculcated here. And show no partiality. So Philemon, chapter 1, 8-16, Ephesians, chapter 6, 1 Corinthians 7, Colossians 3. We all have several things talking about not in dealing with master-slave relations. And essentially what we're seeing here in the Didache is a reflection of these ethics. So, and then a little bit disciplining children. I said basically do not withdraw thy hand from thy children. It means one should, take care of your children, but I think it also has the indication of spare the rod, spoil the child. And it's what it reminds me of is essentially Ephesians 6:1-4 and Colossians 3:20-21, where the importance of raising one's children properly. It means two things. First of all, yes, discipline them, so they have a sense of discipline and order and propriety. But also, fathers, provoke not thy sons unto wrath is the other side of that as well. And this is what they're getting at. Yes, discipline, but don't be extreme about it. Fathers, provoke not thy children unto wrath. This is, again, what we're seeing, this ethics that we're seeing again and again. You read through it. Interesting, the content is essentially the same as what we're seeing in many of these New Testament writings. The phraseology is a bit different. When we see particularly close relation to the Gospel of Matthew, but outside of the Lord's Prayer, which is like a dead ringer quote, most of it is the content's the same, but not the wording, which is indicating, again, this early time period of when depending on oral traditions of the sayings and teachings of Jesus. which I think is interesting. Now, okay, we covered the first 4 chapters. Chapter 5 is all those bad things. Don't do them. You could literally just about put it that way and you get the point. I'll just read a little bit till you get the idea. And let's see. The way of death is this. To begin with, it is evil. That pretty much says it all. And in every way fraught with damnation. Lord have mercy. In it are murders, adulteries, lusts, fornications, thefts, idolatries, witchcraft, sorceries, robberies, perjuries, hypocrisies, duplicities, deceit, pride, malice, self-will, avarice, foul language. Lord help me there. Jealousy, insolence, arrogance, boastfulness. Here are those who persecute good men and hold truth in abhorrence and love falsehood and who do not know the rewards of righteousness, etc., etc. We get the point. Don't do these things. Interestingly enough, you'll see the community rule has a similar section about, let me see if I can do it. It's kind of, if I can just locate it here quickly. Oh, here it is. This is what the community rule of the Qumran community says. But the ways of the spirit of falsehood are these: greed and slackness in the search for righteousness, wickedness and lies, haughtiness and pride, falsehood and deceit, cruelty and abundant evil, ill temper and much folly and brazen insolence, abominable deeds, committed in a spirit of lust, and ways of lewdness and the service of uncleanness, a blasphemous tongue, blindness of eye and dullness of ear, stiffness of neck and heaviness of heart, so that man walks in all the ways of darkness and guile. Well, I think we get what what not to do. So it's interesting, but you see that this point where it's at. The Didachi, we can see clearly this Jewish Christian background. The moral ethics are essentially very similar, mostly the same really, and sometimes the tone is pretty much the same, especially this condemnation of all those bad things. They're pretty unambiguous. It's one after reads this, you know what not to do, certainly. Now chapter 6 is interesting. It changes tone. We're coming to the end and of this section. And it's, perhaps maybe what I should just do is it's very short. So maybe I should just read it. Let's see here. Yeah, it's short enough. I'll just read chapters in this. Yeah, so it'll say conclusion, but it's a conclusion of this 2 ways. It says, take care that nobody tempts you away from the path of this teaching. Maybe we're teaching you in the Didachi. Such a man's tuition can have nothing to do with God. If you can shoulder the Lord's yoke in its entirety, then you will be perfect. But if that is too much for you, do as much as you can. As regards diet, keep the rules insofar as you are able. Only be careful to refuse anything that has been offered to an idol, for that is the worship of dead gods. So it's interesting. Seek perfection, that is the goal. But there's a recognition of a fallen nature and our struggle. So do as much as you can. And with regard to food, at least avoid food offered to idols.
What does that mean?
Well, the problem is that a lot, you would have, like for example, if they're offering a goat or a bull or whatever to an idol, then it would be roasted. They didn't throw it in the rubbish bin. That would be distributed to be eaten. It could also be purchased in the marketplace. Or if it wasn't, even if it wasn't roasted, it was just offered, it could be offered then in the marketplace for sale. And this could be a problem for Christians, because you could buy from certain vendors and that meat might have been offered to an idol. And that's something one should avoid, because you're talking about something that implies idolatry, the worshiping of gods other than God. That's what this is worried about. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because, let's talk about that. Talk about perfection. Matthew 5:48, be therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And then talking about the yoke, so bearing the yoke of the Lord, is Matthew 11:28-30. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now notice the affinities here. Matthew and the didache. Importance of perfection, the yoke of the Lord. Not the exact same words, but very similar content. Now, at this time the didache is being written, Matthew might have just been being finalized in the form which we may have gotten it. Maybe that's a little later. So it's more likely that these are both from the same oral sources and traditions underlying them, rather than the didache from Matthew or the other way around. I just wanted to point that out, but notice the content. But let's take a look. About this, I keep referring to Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem, especially with regard to food. Let's take a look at what they say, what Acts says about this. This is Acts 15, chapter 15, verses 28 through 30. And these are this is the announcement which the apostles made at that point. And this would have been sent then to Antioch, where there had been controversies precisely over this issue, like between the Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians, further indicating the anti-King origins of the didache. It certainly fits in this community. But this is what Acts says about diet. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things, that ye abstain from meats offered to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication, from which if ye keep yourselves, ye shall do well. Fare ye well. So when they were dismissed, they came to Antioch, and when they had gathered the multitude together, they delivered the epistle. Guess what? The didache is clearly reflecting these specific rules, which gives us a time frame of when it was written, and certainly we begin to see the churches we're seeing described in Acts, to see that it's being reflected in the pastoral epistles, like 1st and 2nd Timothy, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, some of these others, certainly Hebrews as well, we're seeing in the didache. And also our friend Lucian of Samosata and that scoundrel Peregrinus, who has such a terrible reputation. He reflects too on the Christian limitations with regard to eating, because it talks about how he fell afoul of Christians. He said, this is chapter 16, I'll just read that. He said, he, namely Peregrinus, left home, then for the second time to roam about, possessing an ample fund of source of funds in the Christians, through whose ministrations he lived in unalloyed prosperity. For a time he battened himself thus, basically he was supporting himself thus, but then, after he had transgressed in some way even against them, he was seen, I think, eating some of the food that is forbidden them. They no longer accepted him. And so, being at a loss, he thought he must sing a palinode and demand his possessions back from the city. Basically, he was suing the city over some lawsuit against him for having murdered his father, or God knows what. Basically, this guy apparently is recorded as a scoundrel. Certainly Lucian doesn't like him. The Christian episode is just one scoundrelly thing he did out of a scoundrelly life of which he never did anything right. And he didn't like cynic philosophers. Cynicism did not necessarily have a good reputation. And cynicism as a philosophy is not like what we think of cynicism, of like, I don't know if I believe that, but seeing the dark side of everything. The term comes from basically the Greek word for dog, and that was somebody else's term for them. These people live like dogs. Well, the point of cynicism was to live life without affectation, especially the affectations of civilization. So you could have times where cynic philosophers might live in some huge urn. It's really huge enough that they could barely sleep in, I guess. Or they might go around naked in public. The thought being, well, animals don't put on suits and ties, so why should I? And they go around naked. That was a reputation. So cynic philosophers are not necessarily reputable. Peregrinus was not in Lucian's eyes, because what was Peregrinus' final act? After an Olympiad is done, he created a big bonfire for himself and tossed himself into it and basically committed suicide in a super spectacular way, making a spectacle of himself. So Lucian saw this Peregrinus as a self-seeking, self-aggrandizing guy who just basically wanted everybody to pay attention to him, and even chose a spectacular way to do himself in. And so you ought to read that thing. It's a pretty entertaining piece of text. And I gotta admit, of all the people in the text, Christians may have come out the best, because he just said they were gullible to people like him, but he wasn't really thinking they were evil or something. But it's interesting, but actually later Christians, such as I think Origen and others, they knew who Peregrinus was. This is a real person. And they didn't have anything kind of to say about it. Well, in any case, I think we get the point a little bit about the food restrictions. But we see here various things about this section I mentioned earlier. It's obviously dependence and its growth out of Jewish ethics. Its purpose to inculcate Christians on how to live the Christian life ethically. The seeking of perfection, the yoke of the Lord, these things clearly reflecting scriptural traditions. We also see the close relation to the book of Matthew in temperament and language. The heavy emphasis on the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, especially Exodus 20, Leviticus 19, clearly indicate an early Jewish community. The communal living that we see in the book of Acts, the heavy use of oral traditions, which would have faded pretty early on, soon afterward. And the continual need to have to distinguish Christians from these other Jewish communities while themselves holding actually very similar values. So there's a double need to make some distinctions. Tend to show, yes, this is coming from a community around Antioch, but also that it's very early period. I tend to say between 70 and 90. Because frankly, when we add to it the fact that we don't have the episcopacy separated from the presbyterate, the bishop and the priest yet, which we already see in 107. It's hard for, and Bishop of Antioch was Bishop of Antioch. So if this is from the Antiochian community, which I think it was, it had to be earlier, and earlier by enough for this to develop. So I would say this is pointing to a very early Christian community based around Antioch in Syria, and closely related spiritually, at least outwardly, in appearance, to the other Jewish sectarian groups. But in ethics, obviously not only close, but they're essentially teaching the same ethical teachings, but here in a Christian context. And that's pretty much what I have for this section. And when we do come back later, we'll go into the church manual section and go from there. So,
thank you very much, Brian. Well, we're ready for a lunch break. And so let's head into the great room, and we will meet again after lunch at approximately 2 p.m. So let's get to the food.